age of anxiety. I don't know if people are feeling more or less anxious as we go through the day. So now I want to pick up on something Catherine said about career dynamics. So the next leader of our panel, Joanna Gordon, is an INSEAD alum who, coming out of INSEAD, goes to work for the World Economic Forum, positions herself as being one of their key people organizing the technology sessions at Davos, and then as she transitioned several years ago, is in a position to see where AI is coming before most and sets up a lovely group called Transform.ai. Joanna, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask my panelists to come on stage. Yann, Lechelle, and André Loesekrug-Pietri, come on. So as they sit down, I don't know if, I'll start with Yann as an INSEAD alum, since we're at an INSEAD event. Serial entrepreneur, CEO of Snips, so one of the leading French AI tech companies today. They build private by design voice assistant technology and solutions. André, who I guess we met years ago at the World Economic Forum. He's had a diverse number of careers. I've seen you in private equity. I've seen you be an advisor to the Minister of Defense of France. And now you are the founder, spokesperson for JEDI. And for all Star Wars, aficionados, don't worry, JEDI is really exciting. So he'll explain it a bit more, but it's the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. So
lives every couple of years.
So our focus today, as I think that the title of the session highlights, is really about AI and geopolitics. And as Subi mentioned in the session before, technology is not new. We've seen it from the moment we were able to master fire, the moment we were able to build ships that could cross oceans, get to space. Technology has repeatedly altered geopolitics and on a global level. So I think there's no more question anymore that AI is one of the biggest transformations of this century. And it's going to change the way we work, the way we live, the way we do everything. AI capabilities are going to change, welfare, wealth, and as I think Putin famously said about a year ago, power. And he said, the nation that leads AI will be the ruler of the world. So artificial intelligence has become a strategic imperative for many, and we've seen quite a few nations in the past few years really start outlining their AI strategies. So before we even get going in the conversation, I really want to ask André to take a few minutes to give us an overview of what's coming out of Paris, Berlin, Beijing, DC.
Well, you can say, hello everybody, you can have if you take a European perspective or a global perspective, if you take a global perspective, as has been said before, there is a very, very strong, it's a craze about which are the countries who don't have the AI strategy. If you take that from a European perspective, and I'm going to focus on that a second, on one side you have most of our politicians, and recently we just had the president here 2 days ago in this area talking about a European consolidated single sovereignty market. And then in December 2017 you have a British strategy on AI, in March 2018 a French strategy on AI, on March 2018 an Italian strategy on AI, in April a European strategy on AI, and 2 months ago a German strategy on AI. So total fragmentation. Each of them tried to solve some of the purposes. It was AI for humanity, so there was this concept of deep tech for good in France. In China, you see clearly there's a relationship with their China 2025 plan of basically leapfrogging in what they call the fourth industrial revolution. In the US, as has been said again, there is not really an overall plan, but a lot, by the way, of the strategy have been inspired was the Obama administration left just before the administration was over as far as strategy. And what we see is that in many countries, it trickled down to politicians that something is different this time. And we know it's always dangerous to say something is different, because people then keep telling you, look, it was not really different, is we are probably touching what was the dream of everybody, is to be able to predict the future. And for politicians, for businessmen, I mean, being able to predict is a way to capture value, voters, trends, etc. And second thing is, has been eloquently said before, there's increasingly a power component to there. And I mean, we can talk maybe later about Kai-Fu Lee's book. I mean, this Chinese former head of Google, who also said, in an open debate, and it was full quotation, China sees AI as a way to dominate again. I mean, and it's a very un-Chinese way of speaking, because China was always, for 30 years, understating. So for the Europeans, for the Americans, it was kind of a wake-up call. So we can maybe go more into detail on that.
Can you just sort of give us a sense of how these different, like in their strategies, are investing in AI, just so we get a scale of, you know, China, how many billions is the government saying they're going to be putting versus...
Okay, I have a very peculiar how do you say, opinion about that, because we all know about the 15 billion of Alibaba investing in AI. I mean, I've lived almost 10 years in China, and when you meet somebody who tells you he's an expert of China, go the other way, run away, because the longer you stay, the less you understand of this very complex and fascinating country. But that being said, these 15 billions, most of them, and I hope it won't have our friends at Alibaba won't be annoyed about that. Most of this is complete bullshit. I mean, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because everybody knows these 15 billion, and it's attracting talent. It's attracting scare. I mean, anxiety is changing sides, and suddenly there is a reaction all over the place. I mean, you could compare that for what the new Chinese president has done from an international stance. Trump's reaction is probably due to the fact that for 30 years China was always understating. Suddenly, Xi Jinping is very affirmative about the role of China, and it creates the backlash. So is it really good for China or not? I'm not so sure. But indeed, when you look at the numbers, the Germans have planned to invest from a government funding point of view around 2 billion. The French, it's 1.5 billion. And indeed, you see what Alibaba, Google, Amazon are putting into AI. What really we need to see is that currently the bottleneck is the talent part. And the second bottleneck is what has been said by Subi before, is the understanding of sectors, because you can only be that good if you really understand the vertical. And that makes the platform so powerful, because they go from technology down to the use case part. So
we'll get to you in a second, Yann, but you just mentioned Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI, and I don't know if anybody of you have heard of Kai-Fu Lee. So he was the former head of Google in China, just came out with a book called AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. And so there's been a lot of buzz about his book, but what I think is really interesting just in the title of his book is that he doesn't even see Europe as being in the race, the AI race that a lot of people are talking about. So, André, is that that type of reaction, vision of Europe that prompted you to launch JEDI?
Well, look, just one word on JEDI. JEDI is the European equivalent of DARPA. It was triggered by a group of, big heads of large research centers, most of the large tech companies, and many founders of deep tech startups. And we hope to have Snips on board very soon.
Let's talk after.
And basically the idea, and that created the proposal that Macron made a year ago in his Sorbonne speech about creating this agency. And basically the idea is very simple, is like DARPA, is not to lament ourselves in Europe that we're always running after the Googles of the Microsoft and today the Facebook of the world, but that we invent the next big thing, that the reaction should not be the one of the European Space Agency when they see Falcon Heavy and say, we will have our own reusable rocket in 2026. This is a true statement. It's catastrophic. But the reusable rocket is a thing of today. How do we invent the next big thing? And the good news is that we are in a time of disruption where no situation is for granted. The three big differences to DARPA, for those who don't know DARPA, happy to talk more about that later, but it's basically driven with purpose. We believe that in Europe, the tech for tech attitude is probably less interesting. It's interesting for the small elite that probably is represented in this room, but for 80% of the people, for good reasons, AI is creating a lot of anxiety. For the taxi driver who brought me here, for the bank teller who gave, long years ago, I visited a bank agency. And we all know GMOs is something that is scary for the Europeans. So we think AI, cyber, and that was our big disagreement with Cédric's Villani's report, is that AI in itself is a tool, but AI that can help healthcare problems, that can be a huge contributor to climate change solutions, that can make the digital transition a human-centric one, that is something purposeful. That's one. And secondly, the second main difference, in order to be short, and this is the most difficult for our countries, and for the French in the room, they will understand. We propose that the state impulses, finances, because, I mean, as a former venture capitalist until last year, until I joined the government, it's only technocrats who think that VCs and industry is investing in moonshots. No, if there's no business case, nobody is putting money into the ultra-dangerous things that create DARPANET initially, that became the internet, or the GPS, or what became Waymo, Google cars, which was a DARPA challenge. When there's no business case, there's no money. So that's the role probably of the state. But the big proposal we made, it should be the ecosystem. It should be the researchers, the industry, the entrepreneurs who identify collectively, and I like the point what you said about having a lot of data is actually creating this kind of maybe positive twist. It's not helping serve private interests, but really collectively we probably are better to identify what are the bottlenecks where this kind of agency can de-risk technology to bring it to a prototype, and then the rest of the ecosystem can take it. But you can imagine traditional ministries, when they hear that, public money managed by a public-private partnership, that create a lot of anxiety. So in what we do, what makes us excited is we really believe that it's time for our democracies, not just to stand still and to see authoritarian systems that have the monopoly of experimentation. And I must say, I'm very impressed by China, Singapore, who have this capacity of trying new ways. If our democracies, on technology, but also on migrants and on so many topics, are not ready to go new ways, then I think we have a real systemic problem.
So actually picking up on some of the points and talking about data, and we've heard it repeatedly this morning that data is a key ingredient to AI. China very likely, say, leaping forward because they have a huge amount of data and they're not scared to use it in any shape or form. Yann, you are in a company that particularly takes a point on, voice assistant, but where it's very much private by design. You manage data in a certain way, and you're based in Europe where GDPRs come in. So if you look at like the example of China, but you also look at the big tech companies that have incredible amount of consumer data, and very often people say it's almost impossible to catch up with what they have. How does Snips compete and at a global level?
Well, there's a fundamental rule which is called diminishing return on data. In other words, it's not because you capture forever more data, say linearly, that your AI models will grow exponentially. At some point, it plateaus. And Catherine said it earlier. In fact, AI algorithms have been around for 50 years. In fact, in 1992, I was building neural nets as part of my final year project for my bachelor's degree. So I was building a voice recognition and visual recognition model with little data at the time. Now, fast forward today, we have convergence in computing power, convergence in data collection, because data collection needs to be in place. And we are building models out of that. But the models, once you have them, they are functional in some ways. So you need to distinguish whether you are living or working on models that depend on live data, or whether the model is built on data that has already achieved its peak performance. So much like what you said, Catherine, in terms of the algorithms, you are unlikely to participate in the shaping or in the fundamental reshaping of the deep learning neural network algorithms. And you may have heard of Yann is largely responsible for this movement. He, in fact, decided to dig in early 90s. He spent 20 years of his life to bring neural networks where they are today. It's been incremental for him. But convergence with big data brought us to amazing performances today. So I talk about models because when it comes to language, language is about to be solved once and for all. So we argue that models that take data by default, store data, capture data by default, can be challenged for certain tasks. So when we talk about the cat and dog problem, there's probably a model out there that already looks at any picture and can make a difference between cat and dog. In fact, if you take your iPhone, put it in airplane mode, do you know that you can search for cats, mountains, horses, faces? There is a built-in neural network that is not connected to the cloud that recognizes day-to-day objects. Try it. Right? It's built in. So that model will be refined, of course. Will be refined maybe by Apple once a year, every OS upgrade. But the point is that the data to get to those models is also already out there. Some people are selling it. So we build voice assistants using data sets. Actually, we buy them from China. But we buy those data sets, which are, for instance, hundreds and hundreds of hours of spoken language that have been tagged with a millimetric precision, millisecond precision, so that we can build voice recognition software from scratch, right? So the model needs to be challenged because for some categories of problem, you do not need to collect data forever after.
So what I find interesting is and I want to sort of get your opinions on this. You know, Macron recently said, if you want to manage your own choice of society, your choice of civilization, you have to be able to be an acting part of this AI revolution. And I think there's been a lot of talk about, does Europe have an opportunity to put sort of its stamp on AI and its values and sort of shape it that way? So you have that aspect I want to sort of explore with you, but then the pivot, sort of what I think you're trying to do with Snips, but on the same hand, here you are buying data from China, and is that following your ethical values and the type of AI that you're...
Absolutely, because that data has been professionally curated and is completely siloed from the consumer data. In other words, we operate our models regardless of consumer data. So we actually bought, cleaned up data, fully anonymized, and we build the models based on that. So there are issues because we may build models that are probably not particularly fine-tuned for, say, English, Indian English, which is very specific. So we build a model for American English. We may have to buy some more data or redo the models for different geography. So the point is, this data is available out there because there's a business for it. So while the Googles and Apples of the world build data from their user base, actually, they also buy data. If you look at maps, if you, again, you know the iOS ecosystem pretty well, but if you open your map application and you check the information button, you will see that they buy data from every country provider. TomTom is one of their main providers, right? So the data is out there. There's a business model for selling data that is, in some cases, fully anonymized. So I think that that's where the tools are available, the algorithms are available, the data sets are available, and so everyone can participate in the value creation.
André, do you...
Maybe just one word. I completely agree with Yann, but let me give a different perspective, which is happening right now. Since a couple of weeks, the governor of Guangdong, for some of you who know China, it's the big southern province with approximately 100 million inhabitants, is going around all the ecosystems, especially the biotech ecosystem, saying, come to Shenzhen, establish your company there, and we will provide you the 80 or 90 million biodata of the Guangdong citizens. The only condition is come here, train it. And this is completely outside of the scope of GDPR. What I just want to say is that once a company like that has been trained with 80 million people, and yes, the metabolism of southern Chinese people is probably slightly different than the European one, but it's probably at the margin, it's going to be very powerful companies that will compete. So there is a homegrown advantage. I'm super happy to hear actually that Snips is taking data from China. But most of the European companies will have, you know, their local environment, and there they will be constrained. So that being said, being a slight attack on GDPR, because I think we have the false impression that GDPR is going to protect us. The big difference with AI is that once a system has been trained, it's extremely powerful and against those who don't have the 80 million. The thing where I think Europe has an advantage, and on that one I would slightly disagree with Cathy, is that I see so many startups, so many SMEs, and even some big corporates who tell you that GDPR helped them to understand what they have in hand. The data mapping, which is a very painful task, which unfortunately also creates barrier of entry, so it's easier for larger companies than smaller companies, creates them finally to understand what the wealth of information they have on their customers, et cetera, et cetera. So that was very positive. And the second thing, I mean, I don't know iOS as good as you do, but what I know is that the first company that really acted upon GDPR is, I think, Apple 4 months ago removed its API that allows any application more or less automatically to have access to your contact list. I don't think Apple became the good company suddenly, but they understood that privacy is creating value. What I would like to see is that we Europeans don't just stop at thinking, okay, we protect ourselves, but how do we convert the understanding we had 40 years ago that our planet was limited and our resources were limited. The Europeans were the first. Are we really the ones who are reaping the profit of the autonomous cars, battery revolution, renewable energy? Not really. Are we going to be the first one to understand that privacy is creating value, not just a strong human value, but are we going to convert that into business models? What I see, unfortunately, is now it's US and even Chinese companies. I was 2 weeks ago, we were together in China, and actually all the Chinese companies are talking about GDPR. So finally, Europe has its first extraterritorial law, but let's not just make a law, let's make business, and let's also see, and that's your point on AI and technology in general, and that's why we are so convinced about this technological sovereignty, is that it's conducive to values. Very clearly, has been said before. Cyber is changing the way our elections are held. Social media is changing the way opinions are shaped. Facial recognition is changing the social contract between the state and the citizen. So if we don't understand in Europe that if we're not on top of technology, some other systems, and it's unfortunate, but that's the world in which we are, we don't have the same values all over the world. If these values are dear to us, we need to do everything we can to go back into the front line.
A comment on that, and I agree, because typically I see it from ourselves and our peers in the ecosystem. So Snips is private by design, so we don't have a GDPR issue. And we help companies comply with GDPR because we don't store consumer data. And by the way, I have a talk at 2 o'clock, so I'll be more descriptive about what I do. But essentially, I feel we're missing an opportunity in Europe, which is to take the high road. In other words, the regulator steps in usually late, typically 10 years late or more. And in this case, much like what it tried to achieve 15 years ago with Microsoft and preventing Microsoft from bundling the operating system and the browser and Bing, right? Because that would have been too much. So they broke Microsoft. They prevented Microsoft from becoming Google. So Google emerged. Great. But so we're back to square one. The point is, in Europe, we are liberal. The consortium, the Federation of Europe, if you wish, is very liberal, permissive. We allow anyone in the world to do business with us here. So while GDPR is well thought out for consumers, remember in Europe, you couldn't change your phone number, you couldn't change operator without changing phone numbers a while back. Well, consumers won. Now you can change operator by keeping your phone number. GDPR does the same. You can download your data from Google and maybe go to Quant. Great for consumers. The point is, and you said it, large corporations can easily navigate the legalities and the complexity of compliance. And in fact, when you look at the big platforms, they have one entry point, one login password, so they can actually ensure that everyone is going to say, yes, I opt in because I don't want to quit my habits today. So GDPR compliance is easy for large platforms, difficult for smaller platforms. And so it's a regulation. Actually, last May, we had a GDPR launch party at Snips. Who makes a party celebrating regulation? We do. A great party. Oh, you were there? Okay, great. So the point is, we are missing the massive opportunity to, and you said 40 years ago, I would go way back. We are missing the opportunity for Renaissance 2.0. You know, reimagining the way our lives are to be governed. Because today, it's the attention economy. And there's a point of rupture. We're starting to feel it right now. But the point is, Europe could actually present to the world an alternative model to consume data, to be oriented, guided by data. And AI, of course, is one of those tools. But I feel we're missing it. Because the US has a model. It's slightly different. It's more business-driven. In Europe, we have this tendency to mix philosophy and regulation. But you know, what about the real vision? That's my concern.
So, what would be that specific stamp that you would want Europe to put on AI if we have that opportunity right now? And I guess this is the time, or we might miss it. I'll ask you both.
To me, AI is part of the problem, but it's technology. So the digital ecosystems, the digital transformation at large. So to me, we need a European vision that drives that. That's essential. And then the rest is economically driven. Not necessarily regulation, but economically. So maybe I can touch a word on what I think the benefits are in terms of the Small Business Act. The Eisenhower administration put in place the Small Business Administration way back in the US. And that's a sort of protectionism that is smart. In other words, the US already being a large market, they promoted, to a certain degree, local businesses, and that allowed them to grow. In Europe, we often look at Germany as having a strong middle stand. In other words, a large structural base of large or medium-sized and to large companies. In France, we don't have any, barely any, right? We have SMEs, and if you look at the CAC 40 companies, they barely do any business with startups. In fact, I have lots of stories to share. They play with us, with the innovation department, and then they choose a large company to do business with. And the Small Business Act in Europe is currently lukewarm. It doesn't really work. Whereas we could actually incentivize companies to maybe even double the amount of purchasing they do with local businesses, startups, algorithms, to tip the balance.
So if you look back at like Macron announcing all this buzz and trying to create this strong AI ecosystem, do you think the big French tech companies are just not stepping up?
There aren't any big French tech companies.
I mean, big French companies in general. I mean,
Yes.
not the tech.
Yes, I mean, they will be, because there is a trend, and I think Macron and the government is doing things in the right order. The Loi Pacte was just voted. Within it, within which there is a law that increases the amount, or at least the threshold for public bids. So that means that startups will be able to sell to the government it's going to be much easier. And then number two, they are going to force a certain amount of purchases also. So they are doing it for the administration. And I think, and I'm part of France Digital, which is a lobby. So we are lobbying to educate the government on what works and what doesn't work, right? And so that's one of the next battles. In other words, how do we bring some revenue to the local startups so that we can grow to become ETIs, and why not the next big thing?
If I can just make one point, I mean, I think everything, I was one of the founders of the French Tech Hub in Beijing, so I'm full in fond of it. But and I'm not in fond of a unified top-down system, because we all know, but and I'm not a fanatic about Europe, but this fragmentation, I mean, I can understand that, and I cite this example often, that in diesel engines, existing players are defending their position so hard, even go to fraud to defend all the billions they have invested. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. But that in a new topic like that, we have this fragmentation, no coordination, and again, Cédric, I made part of my studies with him. So he's a close friend for a long time, for 28 years, unfortunately. But that he goes to Berlin the last week of his report is a shame. That we here are talking about French tech, but that there is no at least attempt to do something on a coordinated level, because scale is everything. Scale is everything. So if we try to have our little strategies and then we say, like a lot of our politicians say, we will coordinate with the French, German afterwards, it never works. Galileo costed 15 billion and 4 billion because we had this geographical aspect. That's one point. Second thing, I think we are living in a Manhattan Project kind of moment, where we can say, okay, either we are careful because we don't know the consequences, that is a bit the regulatory approach we have, or we see other people will anyway develop it. So let's be on top of it. And to give you a very precise example, and again, to complement what has been said about privacy, one of the challenges we're going to launch is how can we create in 12 months homomorphic avatars of the big, healthcare databases, that we can use them without the capacity of reverse engineering. By the way, this might not be a moonshot because already a few technologies already exist. So how do we use this role for privacy, but without staying behind? The other challenge we're going to launch, because it's not all about digital or AI, is, look at the theme like glyphosate, how it's divisive, and we're going to launch a challenge where we're going to put 15 million in pure grants, but give 2 years to find, and not do what the usual French or German or Italian government would do, is say, oh, we have our agency for agronomics, we're going to give them money without a deadline, without a pressure, and without the capacity of stopping the project. That's the second thing. And the third thing, I think we need a new pact. We are talking way too much about the government. I mean, the promise, and I know I'm not, I hope you will tell that to the Élysée what I'm saying, but the promise of Macron was the civil society en marche. That's how he created 400,000 people in just a couple of months. That the governments would do the strategy, the big picture, the priorities, and empower the ecosystem, the civil society. And that's how organizations work. I'm sure your way of management is to give the vision and then to get the best talent. That's how DARPA works. They give them a few topics and then they recruit the best people and tell them, we give you $50 million. That's exactly how it works. And you will work on what you're passionate about. If it doesn't work, we'll kill the project in a matter of 24 hours. So big trust. So it's a pact of trust. What we keep doing is that you have micromanagement, and when I hear that there is a fund for innovation where the board is composed of 12 people, of eight of them being civil servants, I don't have anything around civil servants, but we are going to create the Quero, we're going to create the European cloud. I mean, look at the European cloud, very important for AI. We put 500 million euro in France on 2 operators, which at the end did not create anything. The only one who works, and I don't want to have no shares in it, is OVH, and he is alone. And who owns OVH now? KKR and Towerbrook. Voilà, CQFD.
I'm cognizant of time, so I know we haven't been very good today of opening up to the audience. So I definitely want to, if anybody has questions, do raise your hands. But and as you start, and the mic will come over. But I have a question for you, André. Because you have sort of that, you were an advisor to the Minister of Defense. This past week, Google announced that they weren't going to compete anymore for the Pentagon's cloud computing business. And the reason they said is, and it was a $10 million project, because it would not align with their AI principles. How do you react to that when you know that, for instance, Chinese companies, that wouldn't even, thinking about AI principles wouldn't even come into the equation?
May I kill a myth? Because those people who still think, that's why I used on purpose Manhattan Project. For those who don't know, that was the name of the project where all these scientists, which were assembled in New Mexico, developed the atomic bomb. And the same, for those of you who read Brecht, Galileo, it's the same topic. Should I say something about, the Earth is not anymore the center of the universe, but that will disrupt a lot of beliefs. Everything is dual use today. When you look at video games, most of these companies now are probably much better placed than the traditional platforms to do what we call C2, command and control systems, to simulate a complex theater of operation on a battlefield. When you look at drones, it used to be military, and now the application will be mostly in agriculture, in e-commerce, etc. So every single of these brick is dual use. That's why we said the methodology of DARPA is interesting, is set priorities, decide in a couple of weeks, because nobody knows how the future is going to be predicted. Trust, but then remove the trust if people don't deliver. What we're doing today in Europe is we take months and years to decide, and then we put 69 pôles de compétitivité, or the latest European program for research, Horizon 2020, is 14,250 projects. So we are spreading money all around in order to make everybody happy. What came out of it? So what I want to say is that we need to we need to find a European way which is a purpose-driven. On that one, the AI for humanity touched something really good. The deep tech for good is not just good values, but deep tech for good is something which is going to attract people. And that's my little also slight difference, I would say, to what Kathy said. She talked about GDPR, about regulation. You have the regulation of the states, but when you talk to young Chinese today, and they're much more quieter than 2 or 3 years ago, because they are worried. The pressure of the government has become much stronger. You can disappear from one day to another, but that being said, when they also value privacy. So there are some universal, and when you talk with people in the US, it's the same thing. So on that one, again, I think Europe has maybe some advance in recognizing what is important for humanity. Let's make out of it a business. Let's do a small business act, absolutely, but let's act. Let's not spend years again to decide, because speed, and that's maybe the good news. One last point. We always are focused on money. DARPA, since 60 years, invested 60 billion. Look what came out of it. The European Union, in 7 years, invested 80 billion. What came out of it? So it's not a question of money, it's a question of method.
So I know we're out of time, but I promised I'd take questions from the audience. So are there any questions? I'm not seeing any. All right. All right, well, I want to thank you both very much for the session, and I'll hand it back over to Peter.